Hi everybody. Sorry that we couldn't have class today, but something unexpected came up. But I still wanted to continue with the lecture so we didn't get behind this late in the semester. So today's lecture is going to be on Cyberpunk, and I'll talk a little bit about the characteristics of Cyberpunk, some of the major authors, and then I'll also talk about X-Files, which we'll be watching an episode of in class on Wednesday. So on Wednesday, come prepared, having done all the reading. We'll watch the X-Files episode, and then in the last part of class, we'll discuss it against the readings that you did, for the Cyberpunk unit of the science fiction class. So to start off, make sure you have something to write with or that you're taking notes. You'll first off want to think of one of the stories that you read. Burning Chrome by William Gibson as an important example of the subgenre or literary movement that came to be known as cyberpunk. So if we want to think about the long view of science fiction that we've taken so far in the class, the Golden Age responds to the pulp era which came before. New Wave and feminist SF responds to the Golden Age. And likewise, cyberpunk, in turn, is a response to what had come before and to its present historical moment. It carried the trace of science fiction, its themes, tropes, and images, but it also reworked science fiction as a response to its historical and cultural moment, just as the previous science fiction eras had done. Now, cyberpunk is sometimes called a subgenre, and at other times it's called a movement. But it is the kind of SF that imagines a near future where computer technology, technologies of bodily enhancement, and the networks of global capital have opened up new possibilities and created new challenges. So it's the kind of SF that is usually near future. It isn't far distant future stuff, and it has a strong reliance about computer technology, body modification or body enhancement, and networks of global capital. And these things work together to create new possibilities for people, but also new challenges. So a little bit of background. The counterculture of the late 1960s and 1970s, emblematized by the New Wave's interest in mind-altering drugs, violating taboos, working for social change, ran up against a brick wall. It arguably ended when the National Guard opened fire on protesting students at Kent State University on May 4, 1970. The innocence of the movement, robbed by the Nixon era's embrace of sanctioned criminality and excessive force. Following the post-World War II industrial boom, there were industrial contractions as manufacturing began to be sent overseas. So-called corporate raiders began dismantling manufacturing interests in the United States through acquisitions and liquidations. Jobs in manufacturing went overseas. Politics swung through the liberal technocracy of Jimmy Carter and then back to the conservative presidency of Ronald Reagan. Cold War tensions reached a fever pitch. Science fiction images entered the real world with the so-called Star Wars weapons platform and the unrealized Freedom Space Station, now known as the International Space Station or ISS. Computers went from room-sized affairs to the desktop and the home. And there were a number of works of fiction and nonfiction that explored these shifts before cyberpunk. So I'm just going to you mention a couple of these. You don't have to know all their names, but if you are interested in cyberpunk or more recent science fiction, you might want to check some of these out. And you've likely probably heard of some of these anyways. They include Bernard Wolfe's Limbo from 1952, which is about a cybernetic dystopia. Frederik Pohl and Cyril Kornbluth's The Space Merchants from 1953, which is about megacorporations and advertising. Anthony Burgess wrote A Clockwork Orange, which was published in 1962, and was later turned into a movie by Stanley Kubrick. And it's about youth culture and how culture plays a role in reprogramming people. There's John Sladek's The Muller-Fokker Effect from 1970. And it's about downloading personalities, about dehumanization, and also about narrative of self. In some ways, Pat Cadigan's story that you read relates strongly to Sladek's novel. And also, say the title of Sladek's novel quickly, and you might see that there's also some tongue-in-cheek humor in the way that it's written. We have James Tiptree Jr. again, who wrote The Girl Who Was Plugged In 1973, which is about virtual reality and telepresence. And then we also have Werner Vinge's True Names from 1981. It's a novella about computer hacking and virtual worlds. And if you read it, it sounds a lot like the characters are playing some kind of amped up version of World of Warcraft or League of Legends. It's really way ahead of its time when it was published in 1981. There's also some non-fictional works and non-fictional, some real life events that played an important role in the development of cyberpunk. First off, we have a writer by the name of Alvin Toffler, Toffler. He wrote several influential works, including Future Shock in 1970, that in the work he writes, quote, "Too much change in too short of a period of time," end quote, kind of became a catchphrase for the exponential growth of technology and how important it became to people's lives. Then in 1980, he published The Third Wave. And in this work, he outlined different waves of technological movements and how it relates to the way societies change. So his first wave he identifies as being agrarian. The second wave is industrialization and mass production. And then what we were encountering at that time and continues to today is the third wave, which is post-industrialization. And this heralds the information age, globalization, and subcultural proliferation. Subcultures are kind of, you can think of them as enclaves of culture that exist just beneath the mainstream, but feed back and forth into the mainstream. Then another really important person was Douglas Engelbart. His last name spelled Englebart. He lived from 1925 until 2013. And what he did on December 9th, 1968, at the Fall Joint Computer Conference, has come to be known as the mother of all demos. And besides inventing the computer mouse, he worked with his team at Stanford to create a network computer system that enabled video conferencing, teleconferencing, hypertext, word processing, object addressing, dynamic file linking, revision control, and collaborative real-time editing. And in essence, this work that he completed with his team pointed the way for the future way before it was economically feasible. So imagine, 1968, he created with his team all the technologies, because these technologies were not off the shelf. They had to be invented, but they created the technologies that we now take for granted in the way that we're able to work together online, with the way we communicate together. Fascinating stuff, but that demonstration he gave at the Fall Joint Computer Conference in the very end of 1968 came to be called the mother of all demos because it was the first really in-depth and also the most groundbreaking, important computer demonstration that everyone since then, in some ways, tries to emulate. Everybody from Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer, Steve Jobs, all these guys that give these demonstrations on a stage for an audience. You owe a certain debt, besides the technologies, but also the way the demo is given, owe something to Engelbart. Now, let's talk a little bit about the origins of the term cyberpunk. The term was coined by Bruce Bethke. His last name is spelled B-E-T-H-K-E. Bruce Bethke coined the term as the title of his story called Cyberpunk, published in Amazing in 1983. So it was Amazing, what used to be called Amazing Stories, but by that point was just called Amazing. He tells us, quote, "The invention of the C word was a conscious and deliberate act of creation on my part. I wrote the story in the early spring of 1980, and from the very first draft, it was titled Cyberpunk. In calling it that, I was actively trying to invent a new term that grokked, G-R-O-K-K-E-D, thinking back to Heinlein, and where he came up with the word grok, to completely understand something, encapsulate an idea, a concept, that grokked the juxtaposition of punk attitudes and high technology. My reasons for doing so were purely selfish and market-driven. I wanted to give my story a snappy, one-word title that editors would remember. How did I actually create the word? The way any new word comes into being, I guess, through synthesis. I took a handful of roots, cyber, techno, etc., mixed them all up with a bunch of terms for socially misdirected youth, and tried out the various combinations until one just plain sounded right." End quote. So that was Bruce Bethke, who coined the term cyberpunk in that story that was published in 1983. But just as an aside, you keep in mind that when these works get published, that they're often written sometime in advance, such as in this case, he wrote this story in 1980, but it didn't actually get published until 1983. So the ideas were already percolating, not only in his mind, but in culture in general, before they reached fruition in the publication of the story so that other people could read and see the term that he had invented. Now let's break down Bethke's cyberpunk term. So first we have cyber. And of course this comes from Norbert Weiner's Cybernetics. Norbert Weiner, spelled W-E-I-N-E-R. Norbert Weiner's Cybernetics are about feedback and control systems. And he took the term from the Greek meaning of the root steersman, meaning someone who steers like a ship, for example. In the second, punk. Punk has a lot of meanings: worthlessness, marginality, youthfulness, hooliganism, criminality, and even homosexual prostitution. Think of this as social marginalization. In this case, punk likely comes from its appropriation in music, which is the stripping of rock and roll to its essence, to jettison the baggage of the 1970s progressive rock movement. So cyberpunk was meant to return science fiction to its pre-new wave essence. So it was like getting back to basics in a sense, but then also doing new things with it. Now, editor Gardner Dozois, that's spelled, his first name is Gardner, and his last name is spelled Dozois. You can search him on Amazon or Google, and you'll see some of the books that he puts together. So Dozois popularized the term by using it to describe a core group of the new generation of science fiction writers in an article in the Washington Post on Sunday, December 30th, 1984. He writes, quote, "Not all of these writers are of the same aesthetic school or movement by any means. Many of them don't even much like each other's work. About the closest thing here to self-willed aesthetic school would be the purveyors of bizarre, hard-edged, high-tech stuff, who have on occasion been referred to as cyberpunks, namely Bruce Sterling, William Gibson, Louis Shiner, Pat Cadigan, Greg Bear." Nevertheless, they are the 80s generation of SF, or part of it, and whether they like it or not, the similarities in goals and aesthetics between them are much stronger and more noticeable than the admittedly real differences. For one thing, they are all ambitious writers, not satisfied to keep turning out the same old stuff. Once again, it is a time for literary risk-taking, and once again those who take them are admirable, and that makes it an exciting time for SF as a genre." End quote. Now, the science fiction writer Norman Spinrad, who we know from the New Wave, he also wrote some episodes of Star Trek, the original series. The SF writer Norman Spinrad argued for a different term in his May 1986 essay, The Neuromantics, from Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine. And just as a side note, Gardner Dozois was the editor of Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine. So, this would have gone through Dozois' desk, even though he had already written about the cyberpunks in the Washington Post. So Spinrad saw, I believe correctly, that the romance component of Gibson's triple pun for his 1984 Neuromancer, so we have neuro, which means brain, nervous system, necromancer, one who conjures the dead, and new romancer. If we want to break it up that way, a new romance, challenge to the hard science by exploring what it means to be human in a post-industrial world. So a triple pun points towards the fact that the romantic, humanistic impulse is combined with the scientific revolution's emphasis on science and technology. All right, so now I'd like you to make a note of these key characteristics. There's 5 key characteristics of cyberpunk that you ought to know. The first is that cyberpunk stories are typically set in the near future. So the near future is one characteristic. The second characteristic is that the stories often involve interfaces. These interfaces might be between the body and machines, between the brain and computers, but it's also about cyborgs. A cyborg is a human being or an animal whose existence is mediated by technology. So it's about the way the technology meets with the biology to enable or enhance the biological being's abilities or the way that they function in the world, etc. So it's about interfaces. The third thing is networks. Now there's a lot of different kinds of networks in cyberpunk. We have global capital, we have information, we have the political, we have interpersonal networks, like the connections between individuals. But what we see also is that with political networks, they grow stronger. And interpersonal networks, the connections between individuals become weaker or more difficult to realize. So we got global capital networks, information networks, political networks, and interpersonal networks. But the key thing to think of is networks. The fourth characteristic is surfaces. It's about surfaces. Now, we know characters by their names, what they do, what they buy, the performance of their identity, who they work with, so networks again. Mirror shades may hide us from the eyes or the window to the soul, so all we are beginning to see is the exterior. We're not looking at the interior. Most of the characters want connections to others and to break through these surfaces, but post-industrial culture largely sabotages these efforts. And if you think back to the lecture on Delaney, if you don't have the language to think or conceptualize of something, how can you express it or even think that lack you feel is realizable? So surfaces also have a lot to do with like the linguistic or language that we use to describe the interactions with others and also the way we see others and see ourselves. And the fifth and final characteristic is punk sensibilities. Punk sensibilities. And this comes in two ways. So on the one hand, punk can stand for a challenge to authority. And then on the other hand, it's about distilling things down to their essence, getting back to basics. And the way that comes out is through what we call hard-boiled prose. Hard-boiled prose. And what this means is prose, that's writing, that's fiction writing, writing out, like in sentences and paragraphs, etc. Hard-boiled means that like it's the thing itself. It's boiled down to this thing, and there's no fluff, there's no extravagance, there's nothing special about it. So what this means is for this punk sensibility of hard-boiled prose is you tell the story without the experimentation. So all that experimentation that was taking place with the new wave, that's out. For the cyberpunks, they are like going straight to the story and hitting it fast. Now, another way to think about cyberpunk is that it describes what's called the postmodern condition. Gibson's fiction in particular, discussed by the postmodern and Marxist theorist Frederick Jameson, is one way to think about how cyberpunk describes a postmodern condition. Jameson sees Gibson's Neuromancer as emblematic of postmodernism because the global networks of capital are shown to penetrate all aspects of life and identity and create a new human condition. So first we have the weakening of historiosity. History becomes seen as styles, which leads to history being commoditized and consumed. A result of this is the pastiche, that's spelled Pastiche. The pastiche, or parody, without politics, though some theorists such as Linda Hutcheon, that's spelled Hutcheon, disagrees and also sees pastiche as a political act. Nevertheless, in the case of cyberpunk, it creates a pastiche of noir, a genre of crime fiction characterized by cynicism, fatalism, and moral ambiguity. So we're beginning to see things with cyberpunk of collage and remixing of these historical styles. And in a sense, it makes new things from this cultural and historical detritus. We also see in the postmodern a breakdown of distinction between high and low culture. High culture would be like you go to the art museum and you see some famous works hanging on a wall or a famous sculpture, and this is said to be great examples of human art because art historians have said it so, or because it has has a certain value attached to it, a pricelessness or a high dollar value. Or you go to the symphony, and this is said to be the best example of human musical talent, of not only composition but then of performance. High culture. Low culture is like pop music. It's the music we listen to on the radio. It's going to the movies. It's going to read a novel by James Patterson or Michael Crichton, or science fiction. It's video games. It's stuff that isn't regarded by an elite or by the establishment as being the greatest works of art. But with postmodernism, there's a breakdown between those distinctions, and people begin recognizing that culture isn't on its own relegated into high and low culture, that these things are arbitrarily decided by particular people or groups of people. So these distinctions we begin to recognize are arbitrary. Another characteristic of the postmodern is what we call depthlessness. And again, this gets back to the characteristics of cyberpunk, is that everything is a surface, that we're not really seeing any depth. Depth to the stories that we hear on the news, depth to the stories we might read, or depth to our understanding of the complexities of the world. So everything just becomes a surface. All we see is the surface. We don't see what's going on underneath. Another characteristic of the postmodern is the waning of affect, A-F-F-E-C-T, and the death of the individual subject. What I mean by this is that we are fragmented individuals, numbers within the world machine, broken apart and reassembled without the trace of history for experiencing emotion or desire beyond what is dictated by the immediacy of the present. So we have like this sense of that what we are, who we are, becomes fragmented. And because don't have access to the historical trace, our connection to the past, and also with the way that we're not having depth to what we experience, that we're not able to feel as deeply or as importantly or as sympathetically as maybe we could have in the past. So we have this waning of affect and the death of the individual subject. And then finally, the last component of postmodernism that I'd like you just to be thinking about is that it is heralded by a new technology, computers. So with computers, we begin to see reproduction instead of production. We see simulacra and simulations. The simulacra is a copy without an original. So we begin to see, instead of the thing out there, then we begin to see within the computer space, within what we're going to talk about in a little bit, cyberspace, these things that exist without there necessarily being an original from which they're based on. So let's turn our attention from these things about like characteristics of cyberpunk and characteristics of the postmodern. The main thing I want you to know are the characteristics of cyberpunk, but I want you to be thinking about those characteristics of the postmodern, because you'll notice some of those things as you read the stories and see the X-Files episode for this unit. And what we'll talk about now are some of the major authors. So first off, let's talk about William Gibson. So William Gibson was born in 1948 in South Carolina, and he moved around with his family. His father was a big construction contractor, but unfortunately he died, even more so by choking while having dinner while he was away from home. His mother, Gibson's mother, moved them back to her home in the Appalachians of Virginia, in what's called the Deep Hollers. I mean, these valleys between the mountains where that are very isolated, both practically, physically they're isolated, but then also culturally they are isolated. So consider the fact that he is claimed by some as a Southern American author, and by others a Canadian writer, which I'll talk about next. Now, when Gibson came up for the draft, he told the board that he planned to take every psychedelic substance known to man. He packed his bags and he made his way north to Canada, making important contacts in Toronto before settling down in Vancouver, where he lives today. And as an aside, it's important to note that he was never actually drafted, but he used that as like the excuse, the launching pad for his expatriation to Canada. Now, while I was doing some of my own research at the University of California at Riverside a couple of years ago, I uncovered many letters and essays written by Gibson for the fanzine community. Remember, fanzines are amateur magazines that people put together and then would sell maybe through like advertisements by just the network of science fiction fans. So I mean, he was a part of that community too before he became a writer. a published writer in science fiction. Now, I did notice that his fanish output slowed and ultimately ended when he became famous for the kinds of stories that he is known for in Cyberpunk. In the stories like Burning Chrome, which you read for class, and his later Sprawl trilogy, which includes Neuromancer from 1984, a very important work. I highly recommend you read that on your own. Count Zero from 1986, and Mona Lisa Overdrive from 1988. He does some very important things that form the key ideas of the cyberpunk movement. So first, and let's see, there's four of these key ideas that Gibson did that I want you to know. The first is that he developed rich metaphors to describe the post-industrial world. Rich metaphors are deployed to describe the post-industrial world. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that. If you look at the opening line of Neuromancer, it goes, quote, "The sky above the port was the color of television tuned to a dead channel," end quote. This is a famous first line. This techno sky is above a port, a place where people and goods enter and leave. It is an interface between one place and another. Above it, we see the unnatural image of the sky, technologized, scrambled, something hidden now in the age of digital HDTV. Before, when you turned to a channel without a signal, you saw a visual representation of background radio noise, just white noise. A dead channel implies no communication, or maybe the breakdown of communication, implying there is too much noise for the passage through the port or interfaces. We also know that William Gibson was a fan of Philip K. Dick. Around the time that Burning Chrome was published in Omni magazine, Gibson wrote an obituary for Dick in the fanzine Wing Window from Seattle called "Some Blues for Horse Lover Fat." Again, Horse Lover Fat is Dick's alter ego in Valis, a book that many of Gibson's readers at the time had likely read or knew about. Valis ends with Horse Lover Fat going in search of answers to the 2374 events. But the character, Phil Dick, stays at home, watching TV looking for answers there. The idea of the TV as an interface offering answers and describing the desire for connection is, I believe, something that Gibson continues from Dick's late fiction. So we have a direct inspiration from the new wave that Gibson is carrying on. Alright, so that's the first thing. Rich metaphors deployed to describe the post-industrial world. The second thing is cyberspace. Cyberspace, one word. Cyberspace is mentioned as early as 1982 in reference to a computer deck, but he defines in 1984 in Neuromancer what it actually is. The anti-hero of Neuromancer is named Case. And if you want to think about the noirish origins of cyberpunk, case is also a term we use for like a detective's case, like the case he's working on, trying to solve. So this is the actual name of the hero or the anti-hero of the story. The anti-hero Case is watching an educational children's program on TV. And Gibson writes, quote, the TV is saying this, "Cyberspace, a consensual hallucination experienced daily by billions of legitimate operators in every nation, by children being taught mathematical concepts, a graphic representation of data abstracted from the banks of every computer in the human system, unthinkable complexity, lines of light ranged in the non-space of the mind, clusters and constellations of data, like city lights receding," end quote. The term and its non-place get taken up by popular culture. Issues of phenomenology and ontology from Philip K. Dick are carried over into the post-industrial world through this idea of cyberspace. So it's important to note cyberspace is a term that William Gibson coined. And it's something that we just use today. It's been picked up and used in lots of different places and ways. Now, Bruce Bethke, he came up with the term cyberpunk. Make sure you know the distinction between those two terms and who came up with them. All right, the third characteristic of Gibson that I want you to know is something he writes in some of his stories called "The Street Finds Its Own Uses for Things." The street finds its own uses for things. This is a recurring phrase in Gibson's fiction that means that technology might be designed for one purpose, but human beings can find new uses for these technologies. It also reflects the fact that people are no longer makers, but instead consumers. They buy tools and labels from the big corporations. But then ultimately they can do whatever they want with these things once they own them. But even this has become a contentious issue with the passage of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which if a company places some computer code or some sort of digital component on an invention or on some sort of tool, that it limits what you're capable of doing with it because you're not allowed to circumvent those technological impediments that are built into the technology. But of course, people do find their own ways around this, which reinforces the street finds its own uses for things. It's just that here in the United States, some of that stuff isn't necessarily legal. Now, the fourth final characteristic, or kind of characteristic of Gibson's work that I want you to know, has to do with cyborgs. So the idea of cyborgs in Gibson's fiction is that we are all cyborgs because of the networks of technology, power, and capital. Our lives are ultimately mediated by all these different technologies. The networks of capital get so big and complex, in his fiction even, that they spawn artificial intelligences. So the system gets so big that we can't understand it and we can't control what it does. So we have, first off for Gibson, rich metaphors deployed to describe the post-industrial world. Second, he coined the term cyberspace and defined it. Third, the street finds its own uses for things. And fourth, we are all cyborgs. Now there's two interesting anecdotes I want to share with you about Gibson before I continue on to the other writers. So first, Gibson wrote Neuromancer and Count Zero on a Hermes 2000 typewriter that was built in the early 20th century. Its keys are made out of celluloid, the same kind of material that used to be used for film projection reels, which means that they occasionally caught fire if Gibson's cigarette ash fell on the keys. Gibson admits that he had never used a computer before writing his cyberpunk stories. The inspiration for the cyberspace deck comes from a bus stop ad for the Apple IIc. He thought that the whole computer, the Apple IIc was the whole computer. He didn't realize that it needed a separate monitor so that you could actually use it. However, I did note in my own research that the Apple IIc wasn't released until April 24, 1984, only 2 months before Neuromancer was published. This means that Gibson is likely mistaken about the inspiration being an Apple IIc. But there were other portable computers, such as the Compact Portable from January 1983 and the Commodore SX64, which followed in 1984. So we're not really sure what Gibson based his idea of the cyberspace deck on, but it suffices to say that Gibson did not know anything about computers beyond what he had experienced in science fiction and in other readings. He did not have first-hand experience of computers, and it is perhaps his not knowing about computers that allowed him to imagine cyberspace, because that was way ahead of its time when he was doing these things, when he was writing these stories. So if he knew too much, it might have limited what his imagination was capable of. Now, second anecdote I wanted to share is that the Sprawl trilogy became one of the first ebooks that were available. They were released on a single 3.5-inch floppy disk by the Voyager company. It was designed to be read on the relatively new Apple Macintosh Portable. Over time and through acquisitions, the Voyager company morphed into what we now know as the Criterion Collection, that produces the high-quality DVDs and Blu-ray discs. Then before that, they made Laserdisc. Like the Criterion Collection, Voyager wanted to add value to the books through technology and special features. In Gibson's case, a new afterword to his 1980s fiction, from the early new afterward to his trilogy, is only available on that floppy disk. And if you look online, you can likely find it elsewhere, but originally it was only available on that floppy disk. It's never been published anywhere else since then. So next, let's talk a little bit about Bruce Sterling, then we'll talk about Pat Cadigan, and then we'll talk about the X-Files. So Bruce Sterling was born in 1954 in Texas, but he currently lives in Italy. Two of his major contributions to the cyberpunk movement include, first, his Shaper Mechanist stories. Shaper/Mechanist stories. These are collected in Schismatrix, that's spelled SCHISMATRIX from 1985, and Crystal Express from 1989. So Schismatrix 1985 and Crystal Express is 1989. Sterling imagined a near future in which there would be two mutually exclusive approaches to human augmentation. The Shapers adapted biological intervention, and the Mechanist adopted technological intervention. In both cases, human beings were slated to become cyborgs of one kind or another in order to cope with the rapidly changing technology and living conditions, living in a polluted Earth, living in outer space, etc. He imagined new ways of human existence in these stories that question what it means to be human at all. Now, his second major contribution, which you read a little bit of for this unit of the class, is he edited a collection that was called Mirror Shades, the Cyberpunk anthology from 1986. Mirror Shades. Sterling was the great popularizer and promoter of cyberpunk. This anthology gave him a platform to define what the revolution was in the manifesto-like preface that you read for class. Now, there's two things to bear in mind with this. Besides his characterization of cyberpunk, it is important to note that he ignores a lot of cyberpunk's forebearers, especially women writers like Joanna Russ and James Tiptree Jr. or Alice B. Sheldon. Secondly, Sterling published a fanzine from 1983 to 1986 called Cheap Truth, and he published it under the pseudonym Vincent Omniveritas. Vincent Omniveritas. Vincent meaning conqueror, omnia, all, veritas, truth. Conquer all truth. In its last issue, it reports that Omniveritas had been shot and killed. The revolution was over. It had ended nearly as soon as it had begun. So what I mean by that is Mirror Shades was published in 1986, and it's supposed to be emblematic of this new movement. But in Cheap Truth, Omniveritas being shot is supposed to herald the end in the same year that Mirror Shades is published. So, in a sense, it's over as soon as it had begun. Oh, and one other thing I do want you to know about Sterling, so this is the third thing, is that he coined the term slipstream. Slipstream. Slipstream, S-L-I-P-S-T-R-E-A-M, describes speculative fiction stories or science fiction stories that are ambiguously between science fiction, fantasy, and mainstream literature. So slipstream are ambiguous stories that kind of morph from science fiction to fantasy to mainstream literature. You can't really peg it down as one or the other. Now, the next author I want to talk about is Pat Cadigan. Pat Cadigan was born in 1953 in New York, and she studied in the United States in Massachusetts and Kansas, but now she lives in London. Unlike the other cyberpunks, she studied literature and science fiction to some extent. And in particular, she studied with James Gunn, who's one of the early innovators who argued for the study and teaching of science fiction in higher education at the University of Kansas. James Gunn is still alive and working there, and his Center for the Study of Science Fiction is a big part of the University of Kansas. Now, because Pat Cadigan's fiction doesn't posit a conceptual breakthrough or paradigmatic shift like Sterling Shaper Mechanist stories assert, her fiction is more like Gibson's, where the future is already here, but it is not yet equally distributed for everybody. Never will be, and things will continue on much as they had done in the past, simply with new gear, new technology. There's 3 central themes to her work that you ought to know about. The first is Neuro Narratives. Now, Cadigan didn't come up with the term Neuro Narratives, but it does describe what a lot of her work is about. Neuro Narratives are stories that focus on the brain or on the neurosciences as being central to the story. So in Cadigan's work, the reason I call it focused on neuro narratives is that the stories kind of posit or show the brain as where the real action is. The brain is where the action is. Secondly, it's about marginalized art and creative work. It's about marginalized art and creative work. So we have hacking, we have music, we have video production. These are things that, especially at that time, were more marginalized than they are today. You can imagine that when she wrote this, that there were no MacBook Pros. There were no laptops with built-in webcams. There was no web at that time. But yet here I am able to do those things now, so I can make this video for you guys, even though I'm at home in my office. And the third thing you should know is that the stories are strongly about identity. They're strongly about identity. They're tied to the psychology of mind as much as the biology of the brain. They're tied as much to the psychology of mind as much as to the biology of the brain. And these technologies that she writes about can allow us to share identity through memory, and if we are not careful with our brain-computer interfaces, we threaten our own sense of self, either through erasing our sense of self or incorporating someone else's memories into our own, etc. So there is some threat or some concern present there. Now, some of her work to consider includes a short story that I'd considered having you guys read, but it's equally as good as Pretty Boy Crossover, which you did read for class. But Rock On is another story you should think about. It's called Rock On from 1984. And Rock On is about cyborg enhancements in computer technologies to facilitate shared psychedelic experiences generated by sinners. And that's spelled S-Y-N-N-E-R-S. The world of sinners is shown to be more complicated and dangerous by the rapid development of new technology and antagonistic artificial intelligences in the novel that kind of expands on Rock On, which is simply titled Sinners from 1991. Now, the story that you read for class, Pretty Boy Crossover, is from 1986, and it's about virtual reality and the simulation of human intelligence. It raises questions about agency and exploitation, and its central theme, as is true of much cyberpunk, is the post-human. The post-human, you can Google it, but just very roughly, it's the idea of what comes next for humanity. What effect does technology and technology's influence on society have on the development of humanity? What how is it going to change us, and will it change us in very fundamental ways? Some other works that build on the world of Pretty Boy crossover are Fools, a novel from 1992, which deals with the fragmentation of identity, and then two other novels, Tea from an Empty Cup in 1998 and Dervish is Digital from 2000, which concerns a bleak world where many escape it through online life in artificial reality or simply AR. All right, so now in the very last part of lecture, just want to talk about the X-Files, and specifically about the episode we'll be watching on Wednesday. And then we will, I want to list off some cyberpunk films and television shows that you might check out on your own if you want to get a little more background, or maybe to give you other final paper topic ideas, which again, I just want to remind you, you really need to be thinking about your final paper topics and picking something and begin working on it now. Look very carefully at the instructions in the syllabus, and if you have any questions or need some help narrowing down something, let me know. But whatever you choose to write about, whether it be science fiction, short stories, novels, video games, music, film, whatever, as long as it's science fiction or has some kind of science fictional element for you to test, pick something as narrow as possible. So if you're going to be writing about a TV show, you probably want to pick an episode to write about. If you're going to write about a film, you certainly talk about the film as a whole, but you'll want to focus on some scenes from that movie to give you something to actually talk about. Similarly, if you write about a novel, you pick some scenes, like something that happens in finite time in the novel that you can talk about. And you can pick several of those to round out what your discussion is. But what I'm getting at is I don't want you to take on too much. Like say, write a paper about all of the music of Sun Ra. That's too big. Pick one album and work from that and talk about some of the specific songs on that one album. If you want to talk about Janelle Monáe, you pick one of her albums and write about that, and you talk about some of the songs from that album. But don't take all of her albums as a whole, because that could be too big for this project. I don't want you to get overwhelmed. I just need to see you working through and thinking about how you would develop your own definition of science fiction and how you would apply it to analyze a given work of science fiction culture. Similarly with video games, pick one video game. Don't pick like the whole Mass Effect series or the whole Halo series, for example. You want to pick one and use that as like your case study if you want to think about it that way. Again, let me know by email if you have questions, and then I'll get back to you as soon as I can about that. All right, so next let's talk about X-Files and some other examples of cyberpunk film that you might take a look at. So what we're going to be watching in Wednesday's class, at the beginning of class, is an X-Files episode called Kill Switch. Now, first off, a little bit about the X-Files. Make sure you know how to spell it right. It's the space capital X dash capital F and then lowercase ILES, the X-Files. And that would be italicized. But then the title of the episode, Kill Switch, you would put in quotation marks. Now, the X-Files was created by Chris Carter, Carter, for the Fox Network's Friday night lineup. It began in 1993 and ended in 2002 after 9 seasons, and it does have 2 film spin-offs. And there was another series spin-off of The Lone Gunman, and there's also the related series Millennium, which stars the fellow that played Bishop, Lance. Let's look that up real quick. I want to tell you Millennium TV series. Lance Henriksen. I was thinking it, but I wanted to make sure I told you right. Lance Henriksen also played Bishop in Aliens, and he plays the lead character in Millennium, the TV series. But The X-Files ran from 1993 to 2002. It stars David Duchovny as Special Agent Fox Mulder, if you want to think of him as the romantic. And then there's Gillian Anderson, who portrays Special Agent Dana Scully, and she represents the scientific. Now, Mulder and Scully work together as partners to investigate the so-called X-Files, cases too strange or weird to be taken seriously by the FBI. There's an overarching mythos of alien colonization facilitated by the duplicitous shadow government known as the Syndicate. So if you watch the whole thing and the first movie, Fight the Future, you get more in depth on that overarching mythos. And then again, as I mentioned, there's spin-off shows, Millennium and The Lone Gunman. Now, the episode that we're watching, Kill Switch, was broadcast on February 15th, 1998. February 15th, 1998. So that's 16 years after Burning Chrome and 14 years after Neuromancer. The thing about this episode, the reason I chose it, besides being cyberpunkish, is it's written by 2 cyberpunks, William Gibson and Tom Maddox. And Tom Maddox's name is spelled T-O-M-M-A-D-D-O-X. So whenever you mention Kill Switch, make sure you say that it was written by William Gibson and Tom Maddox. And it was broadcast on February 15th, 1998. Now, this episode is what's considered a Monster of the Week episode. What Monster of the Week means is that this episode does not necessarily fit into that overarching mythos of the whole series. It's kind of like, if you want to think of it as album filler. And we'll get to see that in class on Wednesday, and we'll discuss that in conjunction with the readings for this unit of the class. Now, some other cyberpunk films that you should check out and TV shows that you should check out. And you can find maybe clips of these on YouTube if you just want to see what some of them are about if you haven't seen them before. So these movies and TV shows encapsulate some of the key elements of cyberpunk. And it produces cyberpunk ideas like pre-visioning some of these things, but then also building on and broadcasting cyberpunk to a wider audience. So we have Disney's Tron in 1982, and this is an apocryphal story. I don't know if it's true or not, but before Gibson, obviously published Neuromancer, it took him a while to write it. And apparently, the story goes that Gibson went to see Tron, but when it began and you see Flynn falling into the computer world, horrified, Gibson ran out of the theater because he didn't want it to color or affect his vision of what cyberspace was. Now, that could be an apocryphal story, so make sure, if you ever quote me on that, you note that it's apocryphal and that it might not necessarily be true. Now, the second movie is Blade Runner from 1982, which is based on Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. We have Videodrome from 1983, very disturbing movie, but it's a good movie, but it has some disturbing imagery. We could even say The Last Starfighter from 1984 is a cyberpunk movie because even though it's a space opera where they're going out in outer space to defend the free worlds from the invading armada, the main character who's human is elected to become the last starfighter pilot because he's playing a video game. So you get this incorporation of video games and some sort of network that enables it to communicate with the authorities that are in charge of the starfighter fleet. But then also it's a computer, the flight sequences are all computer generated and really well done. You can say for the time as well. So computers are heavily involved in the production of the movie. We have RoboCop from 1987. Max Headroom, an HBO series from 1987 to 1988, is a very cyberpunk television series. We have Akira from 1988. It's a Japanese anime based on a manga, but the movie is very, very well done, so I highly recommend that. There's The Lawnmower Man from 1992. It's kind of a combination of Daniel Keyes' story, Charlie, with virtual reality. So Lawnmower Man, a lot of computer-generated imagery in that. We have Johnny Mnemonic in 1995, starring Keanu Reeves, with appearances by Ice-T in that. But Johnny Mnemonic was penned by William Gibson. It's unfortunately an abysmally bad movie, in my opinion, but it is Gibson playing with some of the ideas that he had written about that got more realized in some of the other films I'm going to mention following this. So after Johnny Mnemonic, we have Strange Days in 1995. There's Ghost in the Shell, another Japanese anime from 1995. Darren Aronofsky's film Pi from 1998. It's black and white, but it's a very good artsy, disturbing vision of science and technology and mathematics. There's Existence, that's spelled E-X-I-S-T-E-N-Z from 1998. And then the capstone of cyberpunk films is The Matrix in 1999. So before we passed over into the new millennium, we have the probably most emblematic cyberpunk film, which would be The Matrix, by the Wachowski brothers, or the Wachowski siblings rather now. All right, so I recommend if you get a chance, see some of those, or maybe look up trailers for those on YouTube or video clips, just to kind of get a sense of what some of those are, and it might give you something you might want to pursue more in your final paper topic. So even though we're not meeting in class on Monday, we will be meeting on Wednesday. We'll take a look at the X-Files episode and discuss the readings for this week. And then we're almost there, guys. We got another week. We'll do the Global Perspectives unit on Taiwanese science fiction. And then we will close out the class, and then we'll have the final discussion essay and your final paper. So look forward to seeing your work and talking with you more about these things. So I will see you guys on Wednesday of next week.